court judge put in there as some sort of tame tool for the government.
Richard Bruton, I just want to ask you, that poll tonight, it is devastating for the government. But in fact, it's also very bad for you and Fine Gael. So although perhaps the people of Ireland don't want Fianna Fáil running the country any longer, it looks like they don't want you either. The party 28 down 4, Enda Kenny 24 down 7. I mean, you're not reaping the benefit of the unpopularity of this government.
No, that's obviously clear. I mean, I think the public are angry and frustrated, and clearly, you know, the Labour Party has captured the protest mood much more effectively.
Do you still have faith in your leader after this?
Time for leadership.
What we need is, I believe that there needs to be a public understanding of the sort of changes that have to happen in this country, transformational changes of the political culture, of the economic.
Do you have confidence in your leader after this poll?
Look, it's not about me.
It's a yes or a no, actually.
Look, I'm just as much in the dock in terms of Fine Gael's failings. We're all in the dock. We have to look at our whole performance as a party to say why we are not.
Is that a confident endorsement?
I would say that Richard has always been very honest. He wants to be leader of Fine Gael, but he's also been very modest about actually pulling the dagger and putting it in.
Well, look, Richard Bruton, Seamus, we're going to leave for tonight. Thank you very much. In a moment, we are going to be talking live to the Taoiseach. But before that, everybody's had an opinion up to now about what exactly happened in the past few years. Well, here's what the people in power had to say about our economic collapse before we got yesterday's reports.
This is a classic bubble. It's going to end in tears.
Cribbing and moaning is a lost opportunity. In fact, I don't know how people who engage in that don't commit suicide.
The world changed a couple of weeks ago with the collapse of Lehman Brothers.
Banking worldwide is in profound crisis.
The international credit crunch has been bringing about progressively the unavailability of sufficient funds for them to conduct their business, so we had to act.
The Irish banks are so well capitalised that I am confident that they can absorb any loans or any
of this crisis are primarily domestic.
The failure of the international investment bank Lehman Brothers and the decline in other global financial institutions exacerbated the position.
No one really is responsible. I mean, it just happened that we hit a wall. There's international factors.
The situation is no one foresaw this. The international financial crisis that we now have, but I don't want to go into all of that.
OK, Taoiseach, for the past 2 years, nobody really was taking responsibility. It was largely speculative. We now have these 2 reports, which are excellent, commissioned by yourself, by independent experts. Let me quote you page 1 of just both of them, if I may. From Riegling and Watson, Ireland's banking crisis was homemade. Fiscal policy, bank governance and financial supervision left the economy vulnerable to a deep crisis with costly and extended social fallout. And just one line from the Honohan report, page 1, the essential characteristic of the problem was domestic and classic. So it puts a lie, doesn't it, to the notion that this was anything other than a domestically homegrown crisis orchestrated by your own government.
No, I mean, I did a speech on banking only some weeks ago, which pointed out that obviously the trigger has been the Lehman Brothers, but there were domestic vulnerabilities in our economy which were mentioned in successive budgets. The problem is that those vulnerabilities crystallised practically at once and caused the problem that we have. But at no stage could suggest, or the public documents will show and public pronouncements will show that there were domestic vulnerabilities. There always are downside risks, but clearly the international financial and economic crisis exacerbated the problem for Ireland and made it particularly difficult.
But the 2 reports do spell out, Taoiseach, that this fiscal disaster which was visited upon this country was homegrown, and the buck stops with your government. You were running the fiscal policy of this country.
Yeah, but I accept responsibility for all decisions I took. And what I've been saying is, to make this quite clear, because people want to know how do we get from where we are to where we need to get to. But in respect of the history here of this, I've made it very clear all along that, of course, I'm very sorry about the outcomes, but the decisions that we made at the time were based on, information that was available from all of these ESRI, central bank, and basically what you do when you're doing a budget. What are your resources? What are you being told is the likely evolution of the economy, and what are the societal needs,
let me
and
come
what
in
do you
there
need
for
to
a
do
moment.
about that?
Let's just look at a few specifics. On the banks, for instance. Again, if I can quote you page 2 of Riegling and Watson. This was a plain vanilla property bubble. It's clear that bank governance and risk management was weak, in some cases disastrously so. Patrick Honan basically implied the banks ran wild. There were no penalties for breach of prudential regulations. None were ever imposed on the bank before 2008. Why not?
Well, obviously, what's coming across in the report, what we already know and we've already acted on, is the need to change the regulatory system, to have a structure where we have Mr. Elderfield and we have Mr. Honohan in place.
But that's now, with respect, Taoiseach.
Yes.
Why were they allowed to run wild?
But I mean, the point that I'm making is that we now know, looking back, that this situation wasn't working. But it's important to point out that from our point of view, what's government's responsibility is to fix it when we hit the crisis. In relation to the history of it, as I've said, we've made it very clear my decisions as Minister of Finance were based on how it was expected that the economy would develop. And, you know, if right up to 2007, 2008, there were international organisations like the IMF saying that the economy would grow by 3%.
Okay, let me come back in for one moment, just again to quote Reading and Watson, because I'm not an expert, they're the experts, right? They say that people should have known the risks inherent in the huge exposure to property across the system should have been apparent without an army of inspectors. So I hear you, Taoiseach. If you didn't know, was that incompetence? And if you did know, then why didn't you do anything?
But I'm sorry, I did do something. The first thing I did when I became Minister of Finance was actually, I'm the guy who brought in property tax incentives since the foundation of the state, by doing that in 2006. And many of these tax incentives were put in by governments at the time for perhaps good reason, including other governments of different political compositions.
I will come to tax incentives. Well, for instance, also, on page 35 of the Reading and Watson, they said, in an economy like ours, which isn't large, Taoiseach, which is one main financial centre, they said it would be surprising if this state of affairs was unknown to banks. And for instance, did you know, for instance, when you went to dinner in Anglo that time after their shares collapsed, did you know what was happening?
But I mean, I've made the point about that. There's no significance in that at all. That was a social occasion, as a long-time commitment that I hadn't made. I hadn't met anyone in Anglo-Irish Bank.
But did you know the condition of the bank that night?
But that night was back in April. We were talking about the guarantee was in September.
Yeah. But did you know how badly Anglo was and what bad condition it was?
We had a standing group in place from the previous autumn, which was looking at the liquidity issues as they were arising. In other words, how we're going to make sure, as things were tightening during the course of the first half of 2008. But of course we didn't, because until there was a due diligence done by Price Waterhouse and the subsequent nationalisation as a result of the government, we took the decisions properly, and they were at no extra cost to the taxpayer, making that decision in January than was the case in October. And that's a finding. And if I may quote some of the report, because it is important to point out that it confirmed that the decisions we took in relation to these matters they support them. The decision to bring forward the guarantee, the extensive guarantee. I mean, there's a party, Labour Party, who are totally opposed to that. If that had happened, we'd have the total implosion of our economy.
And I hear that.
There's also an important point to be made, that Anglo-Irish Bank was of systemic importance. For the last 2 years, there have been people in this studio and elsewhere making the assertion that wasn't the case.
Let's go back to light touch regulation. Again, if I can go back to the experts, Taoiseach, page 38, Ireland's mounting financial vulnerabilities meant that